afternoon. This is Brian Spiro with IntelliChief. Welcome to today's webinar that we're conducting exclusively for J.D. Edwards customers on the subject of accounts payable automation. For those of you joining us in the Northeast part of the United States, special thank you for taking some time out of the blizzard that we're currently getting in order to participate. So with that being said, we're going to spend maybe 30 minutes or so. Did the same presentation earlier today for folks that wanted an alternative time, and it went about 30 minutes with time for questions and answers at the end. And really the agenda is all about accounts payable automation. You know, why would you undertake a project to automate your AP process? So that's going to be the focus and center of what we talk about. We'll conclude with some information about IntelliChief, and in terms of question and answer, just like any other webinar that you probably participate in from time to time, within the GoToWebinar panel there's a section for questions. Just type your question in there and we'll make sure to take a look at those and answer all of them that get submitted. So let's start off just asking the basic question, why would you automate accounts payable? Maybe some of you are here to get that answer. Maybe some of you already have the answer for your own individual organization. The way that I tend to start off answering that question myself is to throw some numbers and some statistics at you. And you know, you can go and look at a lot of industry studies, but the answer to accounts payable automation, why would you do it? 3.6, 2.94, and 50. Right? Whether it's Aberdeen or these numbers, I believe, are from the Ardent Group. They'll take a look at organizations, right? And in terms of accounts payable processing, they'll categorize those that have fully automated their AP process and put them into a best-in-class organization or grouping. And they'll take the organizations that have zero automation and categorize them as laggards. And then you have your middle-of-the-road folks. And so the answer to that question becomes more apparent when we put it in context of savings, right? So if we take a look at the best-in-class organizations who automate accounts payable, their invoice cycle time, their time to process an invoice goes from an average of 16.6 days down to 3.6 days. The cost to process an invoice, $2.94 versus almost $16. Cost associated with, you know, handling and touching and printing paper, the manpower to perform data entry functions, the paper shuffle and what you have to go through just to route invoices through the organization for review and approval all accumulates up to the cost to process a single invoice. You know, the laggard organizations obviously fall further to the extreme of these numbers, right? More than 16.5 days, more than $16 to process, and those industry average shops maybe do just a little bit better. But the numbers are striking. You know, if you're going to pursue a project for accounts payable automation, these numbers are good benchmarks for you. I think there are other statistics out there that you can leverage as well to start to formulate your business case and your justification. You'll substitute your own experiences and numbers where you can, but you know, not having to start with a blank slate and understanding that there are benchmarks that you can use and leverage, I think is the most important point to get across on this slide. So what we're really going to focus on for the next 30 minutes or so is, you know, how do you get there, right? How do you get to be a best-in-class accounts payable organization? How do you get the impact in terms of saving and benefit that other folks like yourselves have gotten? And I'm going to start this conversation off. We'll walk through it hopefully in a logical flow. But the first concept I want to get across in how you get to automation is a concept of capture in the beginning. Okay? So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is capturing the actual vendor invoices that come into your organization, as well as the data that are on those invoice documents, capturing all of that at the very beginning of your process, right? When they are received, when those invoices come in the door to your organization. Right? So that may or may not make sense, but you know, let's talk about why you would do that. Well, capturing those invoices and their related corresponding data in the beginning is really going to allow you to automate your entire accounts payable process, right, from beginning to end. So from the two-way or three-way match process to the approvals on invoices, the exception handling, the voucher creation, the filing of those documents, right? Everything that happens from the time an invoice comes in your door today to the time you file it away, being able to get control and automate as much of that process. And by controlling the process, I mean enforcing the business rules that you have in place, whether they're for approvals or some sequence of review, ensuring timely responses for approvals and things of that nature. So not just automation, but getting control of your process. And because we're capturing this information, this data in the beginning, instead of waiting for your accounts payable team to manually input that data into JD Edwards, you've got a level of visibility that you just don't have when you're dealing in paper. So because the system is extracting and capturing this invoice data, you now can report on it, and you can have analytics, you can have reports, you can have dashboards that really can help you drive your decision-making going forward. And the more you automate, the more control you get, the more you're able to mitigate the risks that you otherwise have exposure to in accounts payable, right? Whether we're talking about missed discount opportunities from early pay discounts, whether we're talking about late payment fees, duplicate payments, fines related to failed compliance with audits because you can't produce the documentation that's being requested of you. So a lot of risks around your accounts payable process potentially, and capturing documents and their data in the beginning should allow you to achieve things we just talked about. So let's try and break it down further. Let's first talk about capturing the invoice documents, and then we'll talk about capturing the data. So think about how invoices come into your organization. I would imagine a percentage of invoices come into you in the mail, so we're talking about those originating as paper. A percentage, hopefully a higher percentage for you, come in via email. That might not be the case, but paper, email, maybe you still receive invoices that come in via fax, whether that's a standalone fax machine or a fax server. That's what we'll talk about here, fully understanding you have a percentage maybe that come in via EDI, or you do some e-invoicing and download invoices maybe from supplier portals and so forth. But for the sake of this discussion, we'll talk about invoice documents coming in, the majority, in these ways. And what happens today, right, when you think about it, all of those invoice documents result in a stack of paper. Right, what comes in the mail is obviously paper, and if you have a standalone fax machine, that's paper. But I'm guessing if you're like many organizations that we speak with, the emails that come into accounts payable are getting printed off. So even those invoices that come in that way are still very early on in your process being handled as a paper document. And part of automating this process is to get away from that paper and convert those documents to electronic images. So if that's the starting point, then how are we going to get there, right? How are we going to get these documents electronic? And some of it's common sense, and you might do some of this already, right? But the paper that comes in via the mail, the only way to get that electronic is to scan it. So the scanner will create the image for you. On the emails, instead of printing those emails off and scanning them, if you've got a departmental email address, accountspayable@xyzcompany.com, and you're instructing your vendors to email you invoices there, well, the IntelliChief system can monitor that address and automatically extract the attachments, the invoices, and bring them into the system to jumpstart this automation process as images. So no one has to, on your team, manually touch each of those documents that come in via email. Those that come in via fax, if it's paper fax machine, you'll still scan them. If you're doing fax to email, or you have a fax server solution routing them to email, then the same automated import method to get those images obtained would hold true on that scenario as well. Okay. So now that you've taken these incoming invoice documents and you've captured the document itself as an image, now we want to talk about capturing the data that's on that invoice. And so oftentimes the conversation is started with, the concept of OCR, optical character recognition. And that's really one component of the IntelliChief capture solution. OCR is really just extracting data off the image and converting it to text, right? And that's an important part of it, but that's not the entire part of it. If you can look at this screen here in this example, we can see an invoice that's come in, the image of the invoice there, and we can see the fields within the capture engine that have been extracted from that invoice, from the header, from the body, from the footer of that document. So you can set up the capture engine to extract whatever fields you need, right? The fields that you need to create the voucher in JD Edwards, the fields you need to facilitate your two-way or your three-way match process, the fields you need to possibly file this document away at the end of the process intelligently, the fields you might need to drive automation through workflow, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But you can see here that in this example, all these fields are in blue. And what that tells us is that the software is confident, based on a threshold of confidence that you set, that those fields are extracted accurately. So the invoice date, the PO number, the invoice number, and so forth. So in reality, or in best practice, if you were to import or scan 100 invoices through the capture engine, if all of the fields were confident with their extraction, an end user wouldn't even have to see this invoice, right? But for invoices that come in where the software is either not confident that it's reading a field accurately, or the field fails validation against some business rule that you've defined, well, that invoice should stop and be presented to an end user to look at, maybe make a correction or some other determination about what has to happen to it. So in this example, on the left-hand side, the invoice from Brilliant Repair Shop, we can see the sales tax has a yellow field. That is the only field in question with that invoice. And if we look at it, we can see that the invoice had a field, and it was printed on the invoice, $27.68. We can see in the snippet on the left-hand side of that screen that it shows up as $27.68, and we can see that it was extracted and converted as $27.68. But it's just not confident. That decimal point is actually in red, so it might be too faint to be confident that it's a decimal point or a comma or a speck on the page, and it wants an end user to look at that, make the correction if necessary. If no correction is needed, just move on to the next one. On the right-hand side, company, we see there's a red field. In red, as you can see, it indicates that there was a rule for the data being extracted on that field, and whatever data was extracted failed validation. In this example, that's not a valid date. You can't have a leap year and an odd number year, and hence that is showing up in red and wants the user to correct it. You know, you might have the vendor name doesn't match up with a vendor that exists in your vendor table in JD Edwards, or the PO is invalid, calculations don't add up properly, you've got a field that you're mandating be numeric only or alpha only, and it misreads a character, and so it fails the rule, and it's going to stop, and it's going to want the end user to look at it and make any correction necessary. Not only is capture allowing you to verify and validate the invoice data, which at the end of the process needs to go into JD Edwards to create the voucher, it's also going to attempt to perform your two-way match or your three-way match for you. So without any end user getting involved, any PO-based invoices can be put through the capture matching process. In this example here, this invoice stopped, and it was presented to the end user because it didn't match. So invoices that don't match or fall outside of tolerance will stop. We can see here there were 4 lines on the invoice that reconciled or paired to their lines on the PO that came out of JD Edwards, but there was 1 line on the invoice that wasn't on our purchase order, so it stopped. Right? And now the accounts payable professional who's working this invoice might be able to rectify it right here and move on. Or they might not. Maybe this invoice has to be routed to the buyer for a price exception, or to receiving, or to some other manager to be handled. And right from the capture engine here, we can see that the user has the ability to select some workflow routing instructions. So from a drop-down, the user in accounts payable can decide that they need to route the invoice to purchasing, or route the invoice to receiving, so that they can resolve the issue that came up here. Okay. So capturing the document, capturing the data off of that document, validating and verifying that information for accuracy, as well as performing your two-way match or your three-way match, And so that's what we've done up to this point. So now what? What do we do next? We've got this data and we have these images. So this is where we're going to start to leverage workflow. Right? So IntelliChief will now take those invoice images and that data and put them through a workflow process. Any of your PO-based invoices, for example, that passed all the confidence and validation and verification, matching, all of that information will get put through workflow and exported to JD Edwards through the Z-file process to create your voucher, whether you're using JD Edwards World, Enterprise One, right? That's where you get a concept of straight-through processing, right? No one's actually touching those invoices at all. Everything was accurate, and they go straight through. Any invoices that warrant any exception handling or your non-PO invoices, even though the data was extracted, they still need to be coded and approved. Those can go through a further workflow process based on whatever approval hierarchy or exception handling rules you have to get those invoices resolved. All the while, those invoices and their data are also being filed away electronically in the IntelliChief file, so you can have access to them later. And oh, by the way, once those invoices that went through exception handling or the coding and approval process are completely resolved, that workflow, that portion of workflow will again export that data to JD Edwards to create the voucher, eliminating the data entry that you would otherwise perform. All of the documents live in the file, and through the integration with JD Edwards, the ability to update those images in IntelliChief with any data that JD Edwards were to create after the voucher's been created, whether we're talking about a voucher number or payment information, additional details about that invoice that you want to relate to that document as it lives throughout its life cycle in IntelliChief can be passed from JD Edwards to the electronic file. So let's talk a little more about workflow, right? I just said that's kind of what happens after the documents and the data are captured. So let's talk a little more about workflow. Workflow is used within the accounts payable process to do a few different things, right? I think the obvious is route invoices, routing invoices for GL coding, routing them for approval, and routing them for exception handling. Okay? So why are you going to use workflow to do this versus interoffice mail or email or walking paper around the building? Well, you know, that might be a loaded question or an obvious question, but it comes back to what we talked about earlier, right? We're looking to drive automation throughout the entire process and eliminate any redundant steps in your process. We want to automate as many steps that are otherwise manual as you can, right? Continue to get control of the process and drive email alerts and notifications and escalations to ensure that these invoices are being approved and handled in a timely manner that's required, right? Continuing to get visibility. Where are these invoices in the process, right? If you're like many companies that we speak with, accounts payable team will send invoices out for approval and they'll log in a spreadsheet, you know, when they sent it out to Bob, when they sent it out to Sally, when they sent it out to these people for approval, date did they send it on, and they keep following up with those managers if it doesn't come back to them, right? So forget about that, forget about tracking in a spreadsheet and you know, ways to do it like that. The visibility of the system will allow you to drive where things are in the process and just continuing to avoid those risks of payments and making sure that you obtain the discounts that you are otherwise entitled and not losing invoices in the process. So there are a lot of different types of users within workflow by category or role, right? Accounts payable professionals are users of workflow, and they use workflow to do their AP work, right? And to get visibility as to what's happening in the process. So that work could be reviewing new invoices that come in. It could be coding those invoices if that's the responsibility of accounts payable, routing them for approval, working the matching process, just seeing what's out there for approval, waiting to come back. And you can see the screenshot here, just a generic example of an accounts payable inbox within the IntelliChief workflow where you can have really multiple inboxes that invoices flow in and out of depending on what stage they are in the process. So whether they're new invoices that came in, whether they're invoices that, you know, the goods haven't been received yet, so they can't be processed, invoices that have been rejected through the approval process or the exception handling process. You get to define what these inboxes are, and you really create them based on, right, your business process and how you need to have these documents flow through. Typically, when an invoice is opened up in workflow, a document or any type really is opened up in workflow, not only do you see the image there on the screen, but oftentimes you're prompted with a question. What do you want to do with this document? And you get to determine the questions and the responses that will drive it through the process. So here, a very simple example. You open up an invoice in accounts payable. How do you want to proceed? Do you want to route it for approval? Do you want to route it to the buyer for exception handling? Do you want to route it to be vouchered? Right? What options do you need at this stage in the process? And by selecting that option, it will move to the next individual. Of course, you can have automated business rules that bypass these questions and responses, right? Any vendors A through M go to Mary and N through Z go to Tom. The dollar amount in the invoice drives who has to approve it. So you don't have to manually answer these questions and make decisions, but interactive workflow is probably going to be part of what you'd want. Another type of user could be a user out in the field whose responsibility in this process is to code invoices. So maybe it's not AP that codes the invoices, but maybe it's not the approver either, right? There's some intermediary person who's going to code invoices. So being able to have that invoice as an image routed to that person, have that person be able to open the invoice up, apply the proper GL distributions with lookups to JD Edwards to ensure that the accurate and correct GL codes are being populated in here, because those GLs, along with all the other extracted data, right, is going to be pushed to JD Edwards at the end of the process to create the voucher. Workflow users could possibly be and would be approvers of invoices, right? So a manager, a director, an executive who has to review an invoice and approve it might be prompted with a question when he or she opens that invoice up. And they may open that invoice up because IntelliChief sent them an email notification. Hey, you have this invoice to approve. Click this link, right? From their email, they click the link. It brings them right to the document. They're prompted with a question. Very simply, do you approve this invoice, yes or no? If they say yes, and the business rule is such that that's the only approval needed, maybe it goes straight to voucher and JD Edwards. If they say yes, but it's requiring a secondary approver based on dollar amount, it might flow to the next individual. Or they say no, and it gets rejected. So again, your business process will determine where it goes after that initial approver says yes or no to the question. And if we even take a step back, you'll notice here on this screen in particular, off to the left-hand side of the image, you can see a running history. Every action taken on this document, date and time stamped and user stamped with who did that. So from the time it was captured, imported, viewed, approved, routed, notes added to it, GL codes added to it. All right, so you've got this running history of everything that's happened with this invoice throughout its life cycle. And workflow is, as you route these invoices through the process, it's not just seeing the invoice, but maybe you need to see other information, right? You want to see a complete transaction history, every document that's related to that invoice that came in from the vendor. So if you've captured those other documents, you have the opportunity to see all of those related documents. So not just the invoice that came in via email or the mail, but the purchase order that you generated out of JD Edwards maybe, automatically captured and filed in IntelliChief. Any email correspondence that went back and forth with the supplier that you wanted to capture and link up to this transaction. Any receiving documents, the packing list, for example. Accounts payable check or a copy of the ACH transaction that paid that invoice. So the concept of not just a single document, but here a group of related documents that are visible to the end user right from that screen. Visibility, the conversation about visibility often leads into the conversation about analytics, just a different type of visibility. Right here we're talking about reports and dashboards related to open invoices, what you have to accrue for, just the performance of your accounts payable process and the people within it. Right? So because we've captured data, if you think back to capturing the data off of the invoice, all of that data can be used to report against. And so you can have dashboards and reports. The Director of Shared Services can have a different dashboard with different information than the CFO has. The controller gets a report emailed to him or her daily or weekly in PDF format or Excel spreadsheet format. So really any of that information can be measured against, sliced and diced, and presented to the people who need to analyze that information to make decisions around how to improve the process or just see the state of where things are in any given period of time. And it's important to go back to the premise that in a paper, when you're dealing with paper, this information that's on those invoices, it's not reportable, right? It's not reportable until you get it into JD Edwards, and this is giving you that line of sight before that information gets put into JD Edwards. So we've talked about capture, right? We've captured these documents, we've captured the data, they've gone through a workflow process, and really at any point in time, I mean, we talked about workflow and how you can see a document workflow, but what about just retrieving a document when a vendor calls in with a question, or you want to go back and see, you know, a transaction from 2 months ago, 6 months ago, last year, when you're preparing for an audit, right? And you can get at these documents really high level 2 ways. You can get at them from IntelliChief, and you can also get at them from JD Edwards. So from IntelliChief, opening up IntelliChief and doing a search, whether it's a date range search or you're searching for a specific document type or a group of documents related to accounts payable, right? And you can key in certain fields, vendor number, vendor name, invoice number, so on and so forth, that will pull back the results, right? So your search could be very broad, pulling back a number of different documents, could be very specific, pulling back just one document. But you can see a thumbnail, you can see some information, you can click on that and open it up in the viewer and see the document you're looking for, not going to the file cabinet, not placing a phone call to request someone send something to you. So that's from IntelliChief. But what about if you're heads down within JD Edwards? What if you're on a JD Edwards inquiry screen or some screen within JD Edwards and you really wish you could see that invoice or those documents right then and there? Right? Do you have to close JD Edwards down or minimize the window and open up IntelliChief? The answer is no. So whether it's JD Edwards World on an AS400 green screen or Enterprise One, from any screen within JD Edwards, a user could hit a keystroke, click their mouse to retrieve a document or a group of related documents. And this is the level of integration, and one of the integration points we talk about with JD Edwards. This is something that gets set up without any programming, right? Without any modifications to your JD Edwards programs. And it's giving your power users who are heads down within the application the look and feel that IntelliChief is a natural extension of JD Edwards, which is what they're operating in for majority of the time. So the concept of retrieval from the ERP system is very important consideration for accounts payable automation. So I promised to try and keep it to 30 minutes, and we're getting close to that. So let's just try and recap. I know we did the you know, whirlwind tour of accounts payable automation, but you know, well, what have we done? What we've talked about all this stuff. So what have we really done? What have we accomplished? Well, we talked about data entry into JD Edwards manually, right? We talked about invoice approvals through printing off paper, interoffice mail, maybe using email. Talked about filing documents away, and really what we talked about was eliminating those things, right? No longer do you have to key your invoices in because IntelliChief extracted the data off of those invoices. No longer do you need to use interoffice mail because you have workflow to drive these invoices through the process. And no longer do you have to paper file your documents because IntelliChief files them away for you automatically. So we've used workflow to automate. We've achieved a level of straight-through processing for our purchase order-based invoices, which I said the same thing this morning in the webinar. We really didn't do that subject much justice at all. But any invoice that comes in that's based on a purchase order that matches, no one has to touch it, right? So can you get 30% of your invoice volume to go straight through? 50%, 60%, 75%, right? What is that number? That's a powerful number and one that you should be thinking about. Now, your knowledge workers in accounts payable are more focused, right? They're focused on exception handling. They're focused on vendor relations. They're focused on supporting customers internally to your organization, analytics and reporting, right? More value-added roles or responsibilities that you're now freeing them up to do and focus on. And we provided visibility throughout the entire process, beginning to end, from the time an invoice comes in the door to the time it's filed away, through its life cycle, retention policy of 7 years, however long you're keeping those documents. Everything is visible about that invoice, about that transaction. And so why did we do it? Right, so go back to that, one of the first 2 slides I threw up. We did it so that we could become a best-in-class accounts payable organization. Right, we're trying to achieve those savings that I put up on that chart in the beginning. And so you did it so that you could reduce your invoice processing cost by 80%. right? And you could reduce that cycle time by 78%. So what this is doing now, right, you're taking advantage of your vendor discounts, you're eliminating all the costs associated with processing an invoice or reducing them significantly, right? Not just people costs, but paper and storage costs. And you've gained this visibility into the process that you never had before, because that information really lived outside your line of sight. Right? So that's why we did it. And the focus was accounts payable, but I want you to walk away from the session also having an appreciation that the concepts of capture and workflow and document retrieval, those apply to other areas in your organization, right? Other back office processes or line of business processes that you have. So whether it's customer service, HR, right? Not just accounts payable, but the broader purchase to pay process, or not just sales order processing, but the broader order to cash process. Anything that is paper intensive, manual processing could be a good target area for implementing this sort of technology. So in wrapping up, why would you want to consider IntelliChief? Trying to just give you some high-level bullet points, I would say that, with the subject today being AP automation, it's important to note that probably 80% or more of our customer base uses our solution within their accounts payable area. So our internal knowledge from implementation and support in accounts payable is very deep. But at the same time, this is an enterprise scale solution for document management. Right? So it's not just a point solution for accounts payable, it's a solution that can continue to be expanded throughout your organization. We are an Oracle Gold partner. What does that mean to you? Well, it means integration to JD Edwards, right? So I tried to point out a couple of those things, whether it's creating the voucher through the Z-file process or doing lookups or retrieving documents, right? Those are all integration points that are strategic considerations when you implement a solution like those. And I would wrap up by saying that if you speak to any of our customers, they will rave to you about the support they get during implementation, the support they get after go live. And I always like to say that support is just as important as a feature or function within the solution. And to show you that over a 5-year average, our customer net satisfaction, 97%, I mean, that's a pretty powerful statement. And so we always like to brag about that feedback because we think it's very important and should be a consideration for you going forward as you evaluate solutions. So again, that is the Whirlwind Tour. So before we dive into hopefully some questions that you might have, please feel free to take down my contact information that's on the screen. If you wanted to have a conversation one-off, if you wanted to just talk about your own scenario, be happy to speak with you or point you in the right direction of someone here at IntelliChief that could do that, who could do that with you. So definitely feel free to reach out. Again, in the GoToWebinar panel, you're able to type questions